morning, and you are very welcome to today's CBI webinar. My name is Kerry Thomas. I'm one of the editors at a new startup called Tortoise. Great pleasure as ever to be doing these webinars with the CBI. I think what we've got to do this morning is a fairly simple thing. We want to look around at the state of the economy now, catch up with some of the numbers and the data that have been released in the last weeks, while some of us haven't been paying quite as much attention as we were beforehand. And then we want to look ahead. We want to look ahead to some of the big challenges that are coming down the track. So you know what they are. We've seen the rise in new cases of coronavirus this week, the threat of local lockdowns, even local curfews, perhaps even worse. There's the plan end of the furlough scheme, the JRS, in I think just about 7 weeks now. A lot of businesses are going to have to start paying rent again. Those deferred VAT payments will fall due by the end of March next year. And all this while some companies at least are seeing operating losses still piling up. And then, of course, there's Brexit, which we won't talk about today, but it's out there and a factor to be taken care of. So we'll look around to start with Rain Newton-Smith. Rain, good morning.
Good morning.
Rain is the CBI's chief economist. And then looking further ahead as well as around a bit, we've got two great guests to help us do that. We've got Andrew Pilgrim, who is the UK Government and Financial Services lead at EY, and we've got Irene Graham, who's the chief exec of the Scale Up Institute. Great to have you both with us. I'll come to you shortly. Usual bit of housekeeping. We do want to get as many questions in from you as we possibly can, and I think probably by now you know how to do it. So somewhere on your screen there's a button that says questions, comments, whatever you want, fire them in. We'll get through as many as we can on the call, and those that we don't, CBI will try to address later. And if you want us to take those questions anonymously, we'll understand why, and we'll respect that, of course. Just write a non-ANON before you put your question in, and we'll treat it confidentially. But Ray, let's kick off with you. Like I say, I certainly have taken my eye off the ball a bit through August, and there was still new data, new economic stuff coming out. Can you paint us the big picture? What are you seeing around us at the moment?
Well, good morning, Kerry, and it's great to be back. I think there are absolutely rays of light in what we're seeing in the economy, though I would say I do think there are some tough times ahead of us. So if we look back on what the official data has been telling us, so we know the economy shrank by about 25% over March and April, but I think that worst period is definitely behind us. We've already seen growth in the economy, and that's picking up steam. So the economy grew by about 2.5% in May, and almost 9% in June, and we'll get figures on Friday for July GDP, and we expect it to be even stronger, maybe around 10%, maybe a bit stronger than that, but in that sort of area. But I think we still have a long way to go, and I think how those green shoots of recovery look and feel really depend on where you are, which sector you're in, and also what we're seeing is even within the same sector, really different experiences depending what sort of business you are. And it certainly is about location. If you go into areas in the center of London, or I was in Oxford city centre recently, and I think city centres that are reliant on tourists or commuter traffic or students are really struggling at the moment. But on the upside, some areas, people have discovered local shops that they didn't know existed, and so some of those smaller towns and communities and out of town centre retail areas are doing really well. And actually, as a whole, if you look at retail spending, it's actually above pre-pandemic levels. So from that retail spend, we are seeing that V-shaped bounce back. And we're seeing some shifts now between online and in stores. So at the beginning, the real acceleration was all that online shopping, but now we're seeing that ratio change a little bit. People are getting more confident. They are going out, going into stores. So we're seeing an increase in spend in stores. And there's no doubt that the Eat Out to Help Out was a real success. There were some fears that it might just displace spending, but those fears have proven unfounded. It's spending in restaurants is now up on the previous year in August. Of course, the big question is how long does that last? And I think there's a bit of a feeling we could be in this sort of benign window at the moment where infection rates are low, we've come out of lockdown, and the government support schemes are in place. But as we go ahead, the real question are, we're starting to see infection rates go up. How does that affect how confident we all feel? And of course, what happens as some of the government schemes start to be tapered? And of course, the subject of today's webinar, the cash flow support for businesses, the lending schemes, how do we come out of this and adjust to that new normal?
And I think CBI has always had its eye on the autumn and the winter as potentially quite a difficult pinch point for businesses. As you say, does it feel to you as if that benign window that the Bank of England and you have talked about is closing, and that could cause some problems?
Yeah, I think what we're concerned about is of course, primarily it's absolutely around jobs. So the ONS estimate that around 1 in 8 people in August were still on furlough. We know the furlough scheme comes to an end at the end of October. There's a bit of a taper with the job retention bonus, but what a lot of businesses in the really hard hit sectors, the airports, the theaters, people who are supplying into hotels, which still aren't opening, near capacity, they're still really struggling. And they hope that, once we come out of this, as we end into spring, demand will come back, but they're still in a tough time. And so to go from having, from the support we have at the moment to no direct support to the labour market, I think is potentially a challenge. And then the other issue we're worried about is the pressure on cash flow. A lot of bigger businesses have weathered the storm in some ways remarkably well. They've used their cash reserves. They've been able to use lending schemes where they've been available, but we are worried about the pinch point in Q4, absolutely, in terms of rising unemployment, but also how businesses are managing the impact on cash flow, particularly if we start to see a rise in more local lockdowns. I think that's the real fear.
Yeah, and how critical in all those equations is whether or not the JRS comes to an end as planned at the end of October?
I mean, I think it really is critical. I think everyone, I think we certainly feel that extending the JRS in its current form forever would not be the right strategy. But we'd like to see a new support scheme which has more conditionality, more really focused on firms that are particularly distressed, or those who are subject to more restrictions in local lockdowns. But where you might have, and that's less generous overall. So you could have a scheme that had a condition that you had to be working at least half of your normal working hours. So you are in work, but you're just not at your full shift pattern because demand hasn't come back fully. But the company would need to guarantee that that job was there at least for a period of 6 months. You might have stipulations about training in that non-working hours, and you could have other conditions. Maybe the company couldn't be paying out dividends while they're drawing on that scheme. And it would have to be a choice between taking the job retention bonus or taking the scheme. And we think you could have a contribution rate of maybe 30% for the business, 30% from the government, and individuals, a reduced contribution in their overall salary of around 30%. That you'd, of course, have to ensure the national living wage was met at all times.
Okay, and Ray, just before I come to Andrew and Irene, you mentioned the sort of the macro picture. There's the very steep decline, then quite strong recovery June, hopefully July. Does it feel to you as if we've done the easy bit and it's going to get a lot harder from now on?
I think it is going to get tougher, and I think the real challenge is when unemployment starts to go up, because I think, look, even if we put, even if the Chancellor announced today a new support scheme, I don't think it would be enough to save every single job. We will see a rise in unemployment, but we want to keep that as low as possible. And of course, that's a difficult time. And as I'm sure we'll go on to discuss, there are some sectors that are growing. There are some businesses that are growing, and they need that, growth capital for that to happen. But that transition takes time. So absolutely. I think, you know, it is going to get tougher. And I think also, you know, we know the pressures on businesses, you know, the rent schemes that have been in place, that rent holiday comes to an end. VAT for Q1 will be due in the spring. We'd like to see the government consider allowing businesses to defer Q2 VAT just to ease the pressure on their cash flow. And so I think there are measures that could be taken to ease some of the pressures on cash flow on businesses so they can start investing, start creating more jobs as we're in this real period of transition.
Okay, so I think we can probably usefully break the conversation down into a couple of sections. I think it'll help to look around at how business is doing now, and then probably look at forward some solutions that I know that Irene and Andrew and Ray can all chip in with. Irene, if I can come to you, the scale-up businesses that you deal with a great deal, very important, high growth sector.
Yep.
What's your impression overall of how those businesses are doing at the moment?
Yeah, thanks, and good morning, everybody. We've got around just over 30,000 scale-ups in the UK economy at the moment, and then we've got another 16,000 that are on that kind of journey to scaling up. They're adding $1 trillion to the UK economy, and that's the SME economy. So if the overall SME economy is about 2 trillion, there's 30,000 odd that are contributing $1 trillion. So, and they're adding jobs as well. They employ around 3.5 million people. So what we've been encouraged by is the resilience of that group of companies through this. They are definitely continuing to innovate and innovate very strongly. Investment that they have been able to secure is really very much going into R&D and also expansion overseas. And so that resilience is good. And we saw a dip at the beginning of the crisis in their sort of growth plans, but that's beginning to come through, a bit mirroring what Rain's just said. So the summertime seems to have had an uptake then in aspiration again, and obviously we're going to be measuring that again and coming into this autumn period. So that growth opportunity is there, but there is the need to make sure that we've got the right infrastructure around them to support that plan. Now, we as a country have been really great at startups. We're about a third in the world. Going into this crisis, we were 13th in the world though at growing a company. So we've had systemic issues around getting the right access to talent, the right access to markets, and indeed today's topic, the access to growth capital that's needed to fuel that growth. And so what we've got now is a compounding of some of those problems and issues through the COVID period. So what we need to do is make sure, as we've sort of said, we need a new national blueprint for growth with the private and public sector really focusing on these businesses because their aspirations are strong, but you know, it's getting harder.
Yeah, okay. I think we'll come back to all of that, I suspect, in the course of the conversation. But before we do, let me just turn to Andrew. I think it's a couple of months since your report for the City UK came out, isn't it? But it's still rattling around out there, still causing waves. So perhaps you could just remind us what it was that when you sort of surveyed the landscape as part of that report, what you found, what you thought were the major problems that business will need to contend with over the next few months.
Yeah, absolutely. So we started supporting the City UK on this back in April. It might be helpful just give a bit of background on how we got there. The catalyst was a meeting with the Governor of the Bank of England, where the issue of UK businesses struggling to repay debt as a result of COVID, hindering growth, impacting jobs, and of course the wider economy all raised. So after that meeting, we formed the Recapitalisation group that had over 50 firms involved in it from across financial services and professional services. 200 of us all working on that for 3 months up until the middle of July. So it was a big effort. And what we really identified as the key issue was related to the various COVID schemes. It won't surprise anyone to hear that the UK government is now effectively the largest turnaround investor in UK SMEs. To give you an idea of the scale of that, to date, it's guaranteed well over 45 billion of lending via the schemes, and it has deferred more than 30 billion in VAT in support of businesses through the crisis. So the government's sitting on a huge liability here, but that is also, of course, sitting on SME balance sheets, and a lot of it is not being used for traditional growth in the way that we would all like new capital to be used, but it's been used to tide them over during the pandemic. So the aim of the work was to try and find options that would allow businesses to really focus on growth by taking away some of the issues that they picked up by creating these unsustainable debt piles. The hope being that you could protect jobs and ensure that businesses are well placed to grow, pay taxes, and ultimately to avoid lenders calling on the government guarantees. So the focus has been that government debt, and the segment of the economy where we saw the biggest need by far was unlisted SMEs. And these businesses, as Irene has said, turn over 2 trillion. They employ over 60 million people across the UK. So that was the focus, and we did a big sizing exercise back in May, which we followed through in the numbers into the final report in July. That sized the problem based on the amount of existing lending from government schemes, our own EY item club forecasts based on the government model, and sectoral analysis. I mean, it's very clear to say there are many, many unknowns about the recovery from this pandemic. So these numbers are indicative. They are clearly from a couple of months ago now, and we're looking at them again. But I don't think they're going to be out by a significant amount. So in terms of scale, we estimated there's circa 100 billion of unsustainable lending that is going to hit businesses by the end of Q1 2021. Government schemes accounting for roughly a third of this, the rest related to pre-COVID lending from non-bank lenders and banks. Focusing on the loans made through the government schemes, we estimated that roughly a third could struggle to repay them and are at risk of failing if left without a mechanism for recapitalisation. So in effect, 35 billion of lending from the government schemes becoming unsustainable. To put that into real numbers, that's around 780,000 SMEs, 3 million jobs. So as we looked at the problem back in July, it was significant. I think it's fair to say there's been some encouraging noise over the summer in terms of the economy in June, July, as we've heard. I think the big question will be where that goes for the rest of the year. But even with that, we still expect this to be a significant problem, and that was where we started to look at some of these novel solutions that you saw coming out in July.
Okay, and Ray, if I can just turn to you, because one of the questions that's doing the round is really where the problem of bad debt lands. Does it land on the Treasury or does it land on the banks? How critical do you think that is? We've got a question about just that point.
Yeah, it's hugely critical, and you can understand that, particularly if you take the bounce back loans. You know, estimates are that maybe 70% of people who took those out have never taken out a loan from a bank before. These are really small businesses who have generally grown through, you know, borrowing from family or friends, and if default rates around that, you know, could be as high as sort of 50%. And you know, banks don't want to have to go in and be, you know, if you know, when it comes to repaying some of these loans, you know, some of these businesses just aren't in a position to do that. Some absolutely will be able to pay them back, and we hope certainly the majority will. But it puts the banks in a really tricky position to have to go out to these very small businesses who may still really be struggling with weak demand. So I think there needs to be, you know, recommendations. The banks themselves are coming together to you know, working with organisations like Citi UK and having some sort of banking resolution system. But I think, and the challenge is ultimately the Treasury may have to, you know, they are guaranteed, they may have to bear some of that cost. But I think the real tricky thing is you don't want to sort of say, now, don't worry, you don't have to pay back any of those loans. I think there's a challenge around the moral hazard. We want, you know, businesses to pay back these loans. The idea was to provide a bridge to the other side of this crisis. And at some point, we're going to have to move to more normal lending practices where, you know, people aren't reliant on direct government-backed loans. And I think that's the tricky positioning, is how do you, you know, determine who bears some of that cost, and how do you make that adjustment back to more normal lending conditions, knowing that we're probably a long way off, right? That's going to take months, if not years, to get back to a more normal environment.
Yeah, Irene, we've certainly come on to the question of access to growth finance because that's really important. But if you're looking at debt in the sector that you focus on, how big an issue is this for the companies that you spend most time dealing with?
Well, let's be clear, some of these companies haven't been able to access those debt schemes because they are fast growing, they might be pre-profit, they might be pre-revenue, and that's why the Future Fund was developed, and a lot of us worked on that because that was a real opportunity to help in that scaling up phase where you've got different dynamics. Some also are very large, so it's good to see the larger lending scheme coming forward. So there's a mix of all the schemes being used. I think one of the key things though, and coming back to Rain's point about local, we've done some recent research about what are the real drivers of local growth. And we looked at a whole range of different factors. Is it startup rates? Is it traditional debts? Is it talent? Is it transport? What we found was 3 key drivers. One was access to talent. The other was access to clusters. So how do you create a cluster where you've got the large, the small, the scaling companies together and foster that? And the third was access to growth capital and equity. It wasn't traditional debt. I mean, we actually looked at the pattern of debt, and it wasn't access to that. It was, could you access in that local environment the growth capital? So I think we've got to look at those 3 lenses when we start looking at the recovery side and what happens locally as well as the national level. So yeah, those are the sort of reflections that we'd have at the moment.
Right. Andrew, we've had a question in for you. Someone who's obviously paid close attention to your report and wants to know what you think of the next steps for the kind of recapitalisation project that you talked about in that report, and whether your sense is that any of the recommendations in the report are likely to become a reality.
Yeah, well, maybe briefly worth just reminding everyone on the sort of key recommendations. And what we did was focus on the simplest mechanisms we could that we thought would allow businesses to have some more time to get back on their feet, but also that ultimately would allow private sector capital in the medium term. And the sort of umbrella recommendation was the UK Recovery Corporation. So this was in effect suggesting that government should set up a vehicle, having looked at existing infrastructure. There's an important role it can play, but we just didn't think it had the capacity to handle the volume of recapitalisation that would be required. So that would effectively be an umbrella vehicle for the guaranteed debt that had been put out, and then 2 schemes sitting underneath it. One we called the Business Repayment Plan, which converted bounce back loans and small CBILS into a tax obligation administered by HMRC and repaid through the tax system. So that would be means tested, ensuring that businesses would only pay what they could afford and would be calculated based on taxable profits or another measure of business recovery. And one of the big concerns around that was avoidance. So we put in place or recommended a range of anti-avoidance measures. The other we termed business recovery capital. So this converts government guaranteed loans into subordinated debt or preferred share capital agreements. So it's often been labeled in the press as debt for equity. It's not really, because what we're converting these things into is non-voting instruments. One of the big bits of feedback we had from engagements with the likes of the CBI and other business trade associations is businesses at this scale are very, very wary about handing over control. So both of those instruments would not lead to a business owner or founder losing any of those voting rights. Engagement still continues at a political and official level. I think these are big schemes which we're looking at, and a lot of detail and nuance around them. So we wait to see where we get to with those discussions over the next few weeks and months. But certainly, given where we are at the moment, I think we still believe there's a huge amount of validity here and some real benefit that can come, particularly to business from implementing them.
Yeah. Okay. Irene, I guess one of the questions that we wrestle with in these strange circumstances is we've had this pandemic that's to some extent brutally exposed problems that existed already. And then the question I suppose that flows from that is whether the answer is just to do what we did before better, or whether we need structurally a new approach to this. I appreciate that's a really broad question, but where do you think the balance lies between just doing also the kind of stuff we did before and actually trying something new?
No, it is a good, you're right, it's a complete balance. I think one of the principles we look at is build on what works and make sure it's at scale. So when you look at some of the countries that are better than us at growing a business, they have quite a regional structure that they're using in terms of their funding agencies or their development banks, etc. And they have quite a strong at scale long-termism associated with it. So what does that mean for us? And we say build on what's worked. So the British Business Bank, Innovate UK are really important agencies to the UK. They were set up in the financial crisis. So, and they've really acted very strongly in this crisis, but we need them to be at scale. We need them to be able to deploy even further what they can do today. And we need to unlock the institutional capital that's available to us, which is not yet flowing through that system. So some of the things we have to do is dial up what we know we need to do, but actually make it happen. And that institutional money is one thing, but do build on what we have today. Because if I look at it from an investor point of view or a business point of view, one thing you do want is consistency. You want to see some long-term policy measures and levers that you know are going to be around for the long term and at scale. And I think that's one of the things that we've been really focused on when we've looked at these issues is, well, the British Business Bank is doing good things, Innovate UK are doing good things, but how do we make that at scale and reaching all the regions in the right way? And how do we do that also in Scotland with the Scottish Investment Bank and Invest9 in Wales, so, and Development Bank in Wales? So how do we really galvanise that? And there is some regulatory change we need to make if we're going to unleash the institutional capital that's there and wants to flow in. And so it really is a private-public partnership as well. We're not saying this is all about government. This has got to be private and public coming together, and how you catalyse that.
And if there was a case for real structural change, would the regional delivery of finance perhaps be a good place to start? Because the picture's been patchy for years, isn't it? Very London-centric, out of London, all kinds of problems. Is that where you'd start?
Yeah, I mean, I think we say, look, the British Business Bank has got a regional network, but let's see how we can make that more physically in the regions, dialing that up at scale, and that can be physical as well as, how you use technology to deliver that. But we do need to keep a really strong regional focus, and we need as well to look at, we've got British Patient Capital. Is there an opportunity to joint venture that with the private sector that crowds in some of the institutional and private sector knowledge as well? How do we dial up some of our regional funds to larger scale? But you're right. I mean, our focus would be take what we have and make it regionally sound and at scale as well.
Yeah, and Andrew, I know that your report touched a great deal on the role of the British Business Bank. Did you also look at that regional question? Yeah,
one of the big conclusions from our report was that there was a significant issue outside of the southeastern London. There is just not the access to the sorts of capital in some other parts of the country that you'd like to see. So it's a really important question. It's been good to read in the press. The government is really looking at this issue very seriously, and there are a number of questions around the sort of British Business Bank, whether the UK needs a sort of a bigger development bank, an infrastructure bank, what it means with the potential loss of the European Investment Bank as an EU institution that the UK has access to. So I think there are a huge number of questions here, and there are some really interesting models that we see in Germany, with the likes of KfW, in France, across the continent, and indeed globally, that are worth looking at, because it does feel like now is a really opportune time to build on some of the fantastic work that government infrastructure is doing, but build it into something that really is sort of fit for the long term, that has that brand and respect that is going to see us through, no doubt, further upswings and downturns over the next few decades.
It's quite interesting. KfW is often debated, just to come in there. And I think what we've got to recognise is we've got the ingredients here in the British Business Bank and Innovate UK. What we need to do is look at the bits we need to evolve to make that even more global. But even KfW is sort of focusing on, well, our problem is scale ups as well, and how do we do that? What do we learn from the UK? So we've got to remember, I think, what the ingredients we have and how we then dial those up overall.
Okay. Rain.
Maybe just add it briefly. I think the reality is we probably need more institutions. I think as we are leaving the European Union, will no longer be contributing in the same way to the European Investment Bank. That gives us an opportunity to set up, you know, a UK investment bank that, you know, particularly primarily focused on some of those big investment projects where you are, you know, carbon capture, usage and storage. That's, you know, those are big, huge investments that will need both public and private investment to get them at the scale we need. But then we also need to look at how we use Innovate UK, how we use the British Business Bank to scale up some of the mechanisms we have already to deliver the growth finance we need, and some of that, you know, finance is more geared at the sort of firm level. So I think the reality is a bit of an opportunity to scale up our own institutions and create some new ones.
Yeah, go on, Irene, jump in.
I'm just going to say, we talked about a future opportunity fund, to pick the point about Rain said about carbon net zero. Some of the really significant opportunities will need new types of investment coming in. So we talked about something a future opportunity fund could capture those, and how you would look at that as an opportunity.
Yeah, okay. Look, I'll just come back to you, Rain, because there's I just want to pick up some of the questions that have come in. I guess one of the things that we've seen through the last several months is a increased prominence for local and regional government in dealing with the pandemic, and particularly city mayors. That, you know, they've really, in some cases, come to the fore. So we've had a question in. It relates partly to what I think Irene was saying earlier on, whether we see a role for local government devolution in helping with this agenda. I'll put that to you, Rain, first, and then come to Irene, I think, on that one.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think, you know, my personal view is, you know, on devolution, we need to go further and faster. And I think we've seen how, you know, local leaders can really, you know, step up and be voices for their region, but they also know what sort of infrastructure investment they need in their local communities. And we've also seen, in terms of how you communicate to local communities, how you understand the health needs, and how you get messages out to local communities, you need that local leadership. So, and I think there's some practical things that could happen now. So one of the things is that we're hearing a lot from both businesses and local authorities is local government have been given pots of money to draw on during these local lockdowns. But what they want is to be able to keep that, you know, to keep that money over the coming weeks, because it can be very difficult when you're dealing with, you know, the ramifications of a local lockdown, to be able to get that money out to the right businesses, you know, at speed and at scale that you need. So they need a bit more time to make that happen, rather than that money being clawed back and going back to central government as well. It's not a lot of money, but it's money in my mind that would be really well spent. And you know, I know there's been some questions about some of the bigger infrastructure projects we need to see. And look, we know in the north we need that east-west connectivity in terms of rail. Even if there's a changing pattern of people working from home more, we absolutely still need some of these critical rail projects. And the same is true in Wales as well. We need better electrification of the existing rail system, just to make it easier for people to move around. And what I don't want, you know, us to sort of feel is, because we're in this slightly unusual period where, you know, in some professional services, you know, the majority of people are working from home, there's clearly going to be an adjustment over the medium term. You know, people talk to us about office capacity, maybe over the long term being 70% of what it was. But at the moment, you know, people are working maybe, you know, those offices are full maybe 10 to 15%. So we will adjust back. It won't go all the way to where we were before, but people will start moving around the country again. And I don't want us to not invest in some of these big infrastructure projects we need because of some of the, you know, acute changes we're seeing at the moment.
Yeah, and Irene, just to go back to the question, are those devolved regional local governments, are they important to the people that you deal with?
Absolutely. I mean, and that's what we're seeing, as I say, when we look at other countries, is how that regional infrastructure is embedded for the long term. Now, I think you need national frameworks, but you need to have that regionally delivered. In the UK and in England specifically, you will need to make sure the combined authorities, local governments act well together, LEPs as well, local enterprise partnership. So how do we make that happen in a very effective way? as you see with the Northern Powerhouse, the Midlands Engine, and can we dial up some of those regional funds as well, for example, in the Southwest. One option is you create some sort of some regional growth boards as well that may help coalesce that. But one of the things we've got to get right is how that coordination is done. And I think we're doing better at that. But I think that and the empowerment is necessary, and it's really critical. Our businesses want local delivery of national solutions and access locally and connectivity locally. So that plays into what you devolve into those regions.
Yeah. Okay. Andrew, forgive me, we've had a question from Tony Cocker about whether the Green Investment Bank is a good model that we should build on. I couldn't tell you what the model of the Green Investment Bank is, but maybe you can help us if you can figure out what lessons Tony is thinking we might draw from that.
Well, I mean, the Green Investment Bank was clearly set up by government, but it's now a private entity. So that is one example of the government setting up or seeding an institution, which is then sort of taken out into the private sector. And whilst it clearly has a sort of frame of objectives still very much around that green agenda, it's no longer a tool of government policy. So I think one of the really interesting questions we'll have as a country when we look at this sort of critical infrastructure and around public infrastructure is what are we standing it up for? Is it to seed something and then to put it into the private sector, as indeed we saw back with 3i, initially a government entity post the Second World War that was privatized, or are we thinking about standing up something that's very much there for the long term, as we see in France or Germany, with no intention to put it into the private sector and to have it as a bit of a backstop for whatever the economic winds might bring us. I think there's a case for both, but they are two very different models.
Yeah. And Andrew, are you worried that these are fascinating discussions, really interesting to have a webinar about them, but we tend to take our time in making decisions about these kind of big changes like the ones you suggested in your report. Do you think there's enough urgency in the way that we're approaching this?
Well, I would divide it up into two. I think that the sort of the big national infrastructure stuff we do need to take our time in how we form it. If we want it to be there for decades to come, then it does need some serious thought. It's not something you can spring out the hat over a few months. In terms of this unsustainable debt issue that a number of businesses will be facing as a result of the COVID pandemic, I think that is an urgent one, and we do need to act very, very quickly to think about how we're going to deal with these problems. It's not going to be long till we find ourselves post-Christmas, deferred tax no longer deferred, payments are being required. We'll have to see what the economy brings towards the end of the year, but certainly I think there is an urgency for that thinking to be ready as and when it needs to be deployed. Yes.
Yeah, and Rain, I guess that takes us back actually to the first question that came in, which was what should government do, given the uncertainty that which is all around. What should government do to boost confidence when people are just, I think, beginning to worry that actually the autumn might be quite tricky?
Yeah, look, I think we're all a bit nervous. I think you need to be clear about what you're going to prioritize. I know there's been one question is absolutely you've got to keep the schools open, as far as safely possible, because that is such an enabler for the wider economy and so important for future generations. You've got to get a testing system that works, that people have confidence. We know there's a bottleneck in that testing system at the moment. You've got to work flat out to fix those bottlenecks, because that's what's going to give consumers and businesses confidence. I think in terms of that wider support to the economy, we absolutely believe there does need to be some sort of successor to the JRS. These schemes absolutely need to evolve, whether we're thinking about some of the lending schemes we've been talking about today, the JRS, they absolutely need to evolve. It may need to be a new temporary scheme, but something needs to be there. And I think also there's a lot that can be done to sort of ease those cash flow pressures, and many of those are really cost effective. So there are things around time to pay, which is leniency, which HMRC can give businesses in terms of paying their own tax bills. They could consolidate some of those measures, make sure that businesses don't have to pay interest on some of those outstanding debts, these are the sort of things that have very little impact on the government's own finances, but are a huge safety valve for businesses themselves. So I think, if we keep the dialogue open as we are now with Treasury, with HMRC, with businesses around the country about the problems they're facing and the solutions that are out there, we can absolutely get through this crisis. But it looks like we may see more restrictions in what we're all able to do. I'm a household of 6. It looks like my socialization is going to be curtailed over the coming months. But I think, I think that's a sacrifice people are prepared to make if we can keep businesses and schools open and get our economy moving again.
Yeah, well, one of the advantages of being a household of 6 is you get a cup of tea delivered in the middle of a webinar when the camera's not on.
Exactly. I was going to say I will be venturing back into our office within the next couple of weeks, but I'm not sure I've trained my colleagues quite as well as my husband to deliver a cup of tea.
But we've had a final question, because we've only got 3 minutes left, just to put to all of you. Someone looking for an upside on this. A lot of challenges in the UK at the moment, but that said, there are still a lot of advantages in setting up a business in the UK. Let me start with you, Irene, then Andrew, then Rain. How would you sell the UK at this moment to an international investor?
We have a fabulously diverse economy, great sectors, real strengths in our entrepreneurship around the country and in every location in the country. And we're an easy place to do business. I mean, we really do have the regulatory, the fiscal, the language dynamics that and even the time zone that really helps you be global here. So there's a huge number of ingredients in this country, and one of them being, frankly, the fertile entrepreneurship of our business community and the scale-up leaders within that as well. So it's a great place to continue to invest.
Andrew, can you add to that list?
Yeah, I think there's really good news. I mean, our most recent evidence for this would be the attractiveness survey that we put out on an annual basis. I think the last one was in May. The UK continued to perform incredibly strongly on foreign direct investment, and all of the evidence that we had is that foreign investors think that the country is well placed to deal with the challenges of COVID-19 and all of the other uncertain economics that we've got ahead of us. Project numbers were 5% up. I'm just looking at the figures here on a relatively flat European market. UK was surging ahead in digital tech. We got 432 projects there, 30% of the European market, 38% increase in R&D. First place in Europe for the number of new projects secured. So all of this really good news, and I think particular highlights the survey found around digital tech, climate change and health as really big high potential sectors that foreign investors really look to the UK for.
Great. Rain, you've got about 10 seconds to be cheerful.
All of that, I think, all of what they talked about, the innovation, the creativity, the universities, look at the research and the vaccine hope, which is, there'll be bumps along the road, but, we could be the country that, saves the world from this crisis with a new vaccine.
Great. Look, we are out of time. It always amazes me how quickly these things go. But Irene, Andrew, Rain, thank you all very much indeed. The next webinar is on Monday, which kicks off the CBI's Net Zero series. So we'll look forward to that. And we'll see you then, we hope. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Everyone.